All right, so this month we have Kei Koizumi. I've known Kei for almost 20 years and consider him to be a professional friend and mentor at many points in my career. We came close when I took over for him as director of the AAAS R&D Research Development Budget and Policy Program way back in 2009. I can't believe it was that long ago. As he was transitioning into the federal government as in a role at the Office of Science, Technology Policy, or OSTP. I remember he was really supportive and generous with his time and knowledge. We both transitioned to our new roles and we worked quite closely together. We were still doing a lot of budget stuff. And we actually got to know each other a little personally at that time. We ended up living in the same condo building for a while. So that was a little fun little experience as well. He's Kay is a really popular face in the policy community. He's been a member for over 30 years at this point. Noted he started out at the Budget and Policy program at AAAS after a BA from Boston University in Political Science and Economics and a master's from George Washington University in International Science and Technology Policy, where he still teaches the occasional course. He's been a part of OSTP, the Science Technology Policy, in two administrations now. First as Assistant Director for Federal R&D and Senior Advisor for National Science and Technology Council under President Obama, and then a number of roles under President Biden, including Principal Deputy Director for Policy, Chief of Staff, and Acting Director before finally becoming the Special Assistant to the President, and Principal Deputy Director for Science, Society, and Policy, and Acting Executive Director for the National Science Technology Council. I have to say, like, even though Kay has held some of the top positions in our science policy community, he's remained humble, approachable, and ever optimistic about the future of science in the US. All of those is very impressive to me. And it's these maintenance of these positive traits is why I consider him to be a role model for me in this work. So without further ado, I give you Kei Koizumi.
All right. Thank you, Pat. And hello, everyone. I'm happy to meet all of you, some of whom I can see and some of whom I can't. Yes, so Pat and I, as you just heard, go back a long way from as neighbors, colleagues, successors, and all of that. So let me further introduce myself by saying that, I consider myself a somewhat lapsed social scientist. You heard that my background is in political science and economics, which became a specialty in what I call the science of science research or science of science policy research. So it is, the scientific study of the research enterprise. And my particular corner of it was US government funding of research and development. And that was a specialty that I honed during my years at the AAAS and also my initial round at OSTP. But I'm lapsed in that, and I now consider myself, a science policy practitioner and a science policy maker. Again, centered around, well, the part of science policy that gets all researchers excited or exercised, which is government funding of research, but also the many other issues surrounding science policy, including, policies surrounding the conduct of research, human subjects research protections, public access policies, technology transfer policies, and also, more importantly for me, scientific advice and technical information in the work of government. Because my vision, and it's a vision that I know many of us share, is government and other policy decisions being made on the basis of scientific and technical information and evidence. So that science for policy has been an important part of my work. And okay, so in my biography, you've heard that, I've had now, two chances to serve at the White House for the 8 years of the Obama administration and then the 4 years of the Biden administration. And just to get this out of the way, I don't know what I'm doing next. I'm still unemployed, which is why I can hang out with you. And apologies for having to postpone this discussion a couple of times because of the other things that I'm doing. But let me get into it. I want to talk about a couple of topics. One is, I think the main topic is a case study of how I try to use science policy tools to maximize the impact we have as scientists and engineers on society and the challenges that we face as a society. But I also want to talk about the current state, as I see it, of science policy in the United States. So let me, dive right into, the first part of the discussion, and maybe we'll pause and have a discussion before going to the second part. So, let me talk about science policy for impact. And I'll talk mostly about my work in the recent Biden administration. And I will say that, my science policy for impact thinking has three parts. The first part is you have to start with a vision for the impact that we want to achieve. And really, it is why I do science policy. It's because through science policy, I can use science and technology to make progress and help solve some of our societal and global challenges. And to do that, I understand that we need a strong and vibrant science and engineering enterprise in the United States. And you, of course, are all a part of that. But that strong enterprise is a means to multiple ends, not an end in itself. Yes, it is important for the US science and engineering enterprise to remain strong and oriented toward discovery and fundamental research. But it is also important that we do what we can to make sure that that strong science enterprise helps to solve some of the challenges that we have. And I see the role of science policy as both supporting us and sustaining that enterprise and also connecting the results of scientific research to tangible progress. So, at every opportunity, I tried to make sure OSTP in the White House articulated S&T's importance to achieving America's aspirations, as the most recent director articulated, or solving challenges, as I put it. Because, to quote, from a recent document, I'm going to say, today, science and technology is as important as it has ever been because America's aspirations are as great as they have ever been. Robust health, no matter where you're from or what your background is. Overcoming the climate crisis. Sustaining vibrant industries that create good-paying jobs across the nation. Harnessing advanced technologies in ways that sustain and strengthen our democratic values, bolstering national security, and opening opportunity for all Americans to achieve their full potential. The last aspiration I've stated in my own words. I think science and technology should provide opportunities for people all across America and every community to participate in and benefit from science and engineering. So that was our guiding star. And, some people did criticize it because it sounded too applied. What about basic research? First of all, I say that applied research is not a bad word. Second, I don't really use that distinction because for me, the key in my scientific career has been to try to support fundamental research, curiosity-driven research, while at the same time supporting other research and policies to help translate the results of that research into tangible progress. Okay, as I said, my career and my recent work have been about science policy for impact, and that is the vision I have for connecting science and technology to societal challenges. So the second part of my policy thinking is that we have to design policies and deploy policy tools to achieve that impact. Because policies can be designed, formulated, and mixed and matched. So let me talk about one of my proudest accomplishments during the Biden administration, which is the CHIPS and Science Act. I hope you've heard of it. It was signed into law in August of 2022. It's a big bill and 400 pages long. So let me talk about just one part of it, which is the National Science Foundation's new TIP Directorate, or Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. I hope you've heard about this. It is the first new directorate at the National Science Foundation in 30 years. And as the name implies, through innovation and partnerships, it is about trying to extend the impacts of what NSF has traditionally funded, which is fundamental research, primarily at universities, into societal impacts through the wise use of partnerships, consortia, and other ways of bringing, and networks to bring people together. And so, was deliberately designed by people like me and others to be about a variety of policy tools to try to extend that impact. So the TIP Directorate does fund traditional research projects, as NSF has long done, but it also funds things we call translation accelerators that are, partnerships, that are, support for boundary spanning organizations to bring, performers and companies and organizations in various sectors of our society together for some kind of impact. It supports test beds of shared and accessible infrastructure. It supports planning and capacity building awards to help democratize innovation and make it sustainable all across the country, with explicit attention to geographic diversity, such as the geographic diversity, of course, that is represented in this consortium that I'm talking to today. It supports entrepreneurial fellowships, and it supports scholarships and fellowships with explicit attention to broadening participation and encouraging innovation. All of these are designed to, through policy, encourage and promote knowledge spillovers and to make sure that those knowledge spillovers result in some kind of societal impact on the society well beyond the research community. And I think important in that is making sure that the policies are articulated both in terms of economic as well as non-economic goals. So I'm turning to the CHIPS and Science Act. That section, which created the new TIP Directorate, has both key technology focus areas and also challenges. The key technology focus areas, there are 10 of them, and those may be familiar to most of us, including AI, high-performance computing, quantum information science technology, advanced communications technology, etc. But the TIP Directorate is also focused on challenges, and among them are inequitable access to education, opportunity, or other services. That is one challenge that NSF TIP is designed to solve. Another is U.S. workforce development and skills gaps. And a third is climate change and environmental sustainability. So those are not scientific goals, obviously. Those are societal challenges. And it's important, I think, for this new NSF director to be focused not just on science and technology areas, but also on these challenges. And here's a little aside. I mean, these are not scientific. I mean, even the 10 scientific goals were not derived from a scientific process. These are political. And to me, political is not a bad word. I mean, I'm a part-time political scientist. Politics is the way in which we make moral and value choices among competing priorities. And so it can be and should be used to good ends, but it is the basis on which we make many decisions on policy. Okay, another side note, it was important in this policy to build in evaluation because we ultimately have to be able to tell the story of how these policies and these programs have created some kind of societal impact. Okay, the third thing that I think is important for science policy with impact is people. It takes a team of people who share the common goal of achieving impact. That is why, so many of those funding mechanisms that I listed for you with coming out of the CHIPS and Science Act are focused on building teams of people. That is, broadening participation in science and engineering. That is, giving different kinds of support, whether it's an entrepreneurial support or graduate education support or fellowship support, to make sure that we involve people from multiple backgrounds in the work of science, technology, and innovation. And as I said, it was important to help democratize innovation, especially on the dimensions of geographic diversity, so that people all across America can participate in this work of translating science into innovation. So that, and and on a broader scale, I'm going here to tell you that science and technology policy, it is a team sport and it's a social sport in that, you have people like me, a career S&T policy person, but also scientists and engineers from multiple disciplines, public policy wonks, lawyers, journalists, communicators, policy researchers. And all of those people from different backgrounds all across the country were important to not only getting the CHIPS and Science Act signed into law, but then now doing the work of implementing and standing up this new NSF directorate to create regional innovation engines around the country to sustain science policy for impact. So let me review. So this part, I describe this vision of how science policy tools, used with vision, with attention to specific policy tools, and with a team of people, can create scientific impacts and societal impacts and economic impacts from the traditional federal government funding of research. So that is kind of the vision that I wanted to share with you. And I don't know what's going to happen to this. This is an experiment that is ongoing. This new NSF chip directorate and other things that were stood up by the CHIPS and Science Act from 3 years ago, it's still a work in progress. And my role now is to keep an eye on it and be helpful when I can for both doing these experiments and evaluating the results of those experiments. Let me turn to what's going on as I see it. Well, as you probably know, I've left my job, or actually my job left me in January of this year. And since then I have been, well, watching, but also participating in taking stock of what is happening to the U.S. research enterprise. And I will say, as all of you know, these are uncertain times. These are unstable times. And so I am worried, but cautiously optimistic about what's happening to science policy in the United States. So let me focus on 3 areas. Let me start first with science funding. As most of you know, the Trump administration has proposed substantial, steep, damaging, devastating, choose the word, cuts to federal research funding pretty much across the board, including a 50% cut in 1 year to the National Science Foundation, similarly sized cuts to the National Institutes of Health and many Department of Energy programs, et cetera, et cetera. And these were cuts that are proposed for federal government's fiscal year 2026, which starts next week on October 1st. But, in the US system, it's the president who proposes, Congress who disposes. And right now we are caught in this struggle between Congress and the president as to what the final funding levels for research programs and other programs is going to be. The good news for us, and my source of optimism, is that by and large, Congress has rejected those steep proposed cuts in the draft appropriations bills that Congress has considered so far. And that means that it's going to take some discussion for Congress and the president to settle on the final funding levels for research and other programs in 2026. In the meantime, what looms is the possibility of a government shutdown, because as many of us know, Nearly all federal research funding is year to year, so it's annual, which is always a challenge for long-term projects like research or infrastructure or many other activities. But that's the system that we have. And so unless, Congress and the president can agree on a temporary funding scheme to carry us into this new fiscal year, then many government programs, including research programs, have to shut down or stop funding. So that looms before us. Of course, it's my hope and actually my experience based on a lot of years of watching this stuff that, although there are occasional shutdowns and they are damaging, most years Congress and the president are able to agree on a temporary funding scheme to carry us into the new fiscal year until they can come to an agreement on final appropriations. It's going to be tougher this year just because, well, the Congress, with its generally flat funding levels for research programs, is very far apart from what the Trump administration has proposed, those steep cuts to research. Longer term, I don't know where we're headed. I was very proud that in the Biden administration, we were able to accomplish the federal government investing $200 billion a year in research and development, including of that $100 billion a year for basic and applied research, most of which goes to colleges and universities. But I don't think we're going to get there, uh, frankly, in this coming fiscal year and the next fiscal year. And what that means for government funding, which has been a source of U.S. leadership in science and engineering, I don't know. So it is difficult for me to remain optimistic over the longer term, even though I'm cautiously optimistic about how funding is going to shake out in the shorter term for this next year. Another part of that I worry about is an important ingredient in science engineering, which is people. You have heard about the layoffs, the buyouts, the reductions in force of federal government scientists and engineers, including national lab scientists and engineers. That is real. And in fact, many of my colleagues who were at the OSTP, who were civil servants and then went back to their agencies after my time in office ended, then went back to their agencies only to lose their jobs earlier this year. And that, of course, is very troubling because the government performs a lot of the research and development that the government needs, especially at the mission agencies like the Department of the Interior, Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Transportation, who rely on their own performed research to aid in their missions of environmental protections or transportation. So that loss of capability for the US government, I think, has already been devastating. And I don't know what the future of that workforce is going to be. And of course, I'm aware that the funding cuts and grant cancellations that have already taken place for the university community have resulted in job losses among faculty and especially early career scientists and postdocs. This area, I don't know. I'm less optimistic than in others because, I mean, the federal government has been, and I hope continues to be, a leading employer of scientists and engineers, and has been, and I hope continues to be, a supporter of scientists and engineers in external institutions. But I'm not getting a clear signal as to how this administration and this Congress wanted to treat the US scientific and technical workforce. The third part that I want to focus on is the infrastructure, scientific infrastructure. Here, I'm getting unclear signals that, a lot of the important work of, of computing infrastructure, research buildings and facilities, and data infrastructure has been the responsibility of the federal government because to sustain a national research infrastructure that enables our world-leading US research ecosystem. I'm not getting clear signals other than that there are extensive budget cuts proposed for those facilities. And many of us here in Washington, D.C. have been advocating for not only sustained research funding, but also, of course, robust support for the infrastructure necessary to do that research. But the fate of those proposals hangs in the balance with the Congress and with the White House. So that is my kind of short tour through, science policy in these uncertain times. And yes, I'm finding it hard to stay in my naturally optimistic mood. I will be honest with you about that. But what gives me some hope and optimism is that, as long as I'm around and as long as, colleagues both inside and outside Washington, D.C. are around, we are going to be engaged and trying to do battle to make sure that we sustain what has made America great and what has made our research enterprise the envy of the world, rightly so. So that's kind of a message that I want to conclude with you. And now let's talk because I'm looking forward to this discussion. In fact, let me turn back to Pat as host while I catch up on what you've been saying in the chat. Okay? Thank you.
Thanks, Kei. Any questions from the audience or comments, thoughts?
I have a question. This was really very timely, the presentation. My question has to do with, are there fears of people leaving the US and going to other countries, scientists, engineers, technologists?
Yes. The short answer is yes. I fear that. Um, and I think that fear is becoming clearer because in the first part of this year, we heard these news reports of France and Germany and other nations like putting up funding to attract US-based scientists, especially, people who came from those nations originally, back to those countries. And at first I was skeptical because, well, it's one thing to announce it, but it's another thing to actually put up the money. We'll say those fears have become more real because I've now talked to a couple of people, including some friends, who have gotten pretty solid offers from other nations to, move their labs to another country. And, like 5 million euros, for example, in like guaranteed startup funding. So those fears are becoming real to me. And I will say that, well, on balance, I mean, for global science, I think that's a good thing because it means that we're not losing the capability, we're not losing the team. But of course, I'm sad that the United States is losing that capability and that capacity. And, it is personal to me because, my parents were both research professors who came from Japan to, have research careers in the United States. So the welcoming environment and the supported environment that US universities had enabled them to build research careers here in the United States. And I'm a result. Um, and I don't want to lose that. But at the same time, I think a little bit of that is inevitable.
Thank you.
Matthew, thank you for your notes, Matthew.
Yeah, I put this in the doc
Mhm.
just it's useful just for me to write it down.
Yeah.
But the question is, because we're seeing the dramatic impact, add the H-1B visa nonsense to it.
Yeah.
Is that from your sort of science policy perspective, What are the sort of essential tasks that a new administration who wishes to view the federal government as a valuable player to rebuild its internal infrastructure, its people, both in terms of actual scientists, but also all of those administrators, whether it's at DOE, NSF, wherever, because those civil servants are essential to make the entire apparatus flow smoother. And just as a note, like, it's not going to be a snap of the fingers. So I'm just curious what your sort of policy perspective of, if things get better, what is the trajectory we want to move on?
Yeah, good question. And of course, a bunch of us are thinking about that. And part of it's informed by, my experience of doing just that. Of course, I was at OSTP during the Obama administration. I had 4 years away. A bunch of us got together and plotted, well, what would the next Democratic administration look like? And we managed to put together a policy agenda for the Biden administration. And for me, in my point of view, it worked out well, and I'm happy we had a lot of those 4 years to try to put together agenda. And I mean, I'm not giving away any secrets here. One part of it was undoing some of the damage of the Trump administration. So, a list of policies to undo. I think this time around, it's an essential part of it will be to rehire or reconstitute the federal scientific and civil service workforce. Because I mean, they were there for a reason. I mean, these civil servants, many of whom I have had the chance to work with, I mean, they were doing important work on behalf of the American people. And the need for that work has not gone away. So I hope that, the next administration of whatever flavor will commit to, restoring capacity by civil servants, including scientists, in the work of the federal government. And third, I think it's every change in administration is an opportunity to kind of reimagine, well, what does the U.S. science and engineering enterprise look like now? And how should the U.S. government respond? Because in the past few years to decades, we've all witnessed, colossal changes in the U.S. enterprise. I mean, just to name a few, it's the increasing and accelerating globalization of research collaborations. Two, the incursion of AI into research in all fields, because scientists are now using AI in a variety of fields well outside of AI research. And three, the increasing push for more open and collaborative science, open data, open access. So those are just three of the ways in which, policymakers and all of us have to respond to a changing environment. So the next presidential administration will also have to grapple with that as well.
Thanks. Anyone else? Any questions?
I have one more.
Sure.
But from a historical perspective, are there analogies to another time that this type of um, uh, disruption has happened and we've had to dig out of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the example that most people have been using is what Nazi Germany did in their time in power, in pushing out many scientists. And at that time, most of them came to the United States, and the United States was able to support them, and therefore we built the U.S. science and engineering enterprise that we know today. that's, I think, the closest analogy that people have been using. I find it hard to, in many areas, I like to learn from history and find these analogies. This one has been a little bit more difficult for me. So I'm looking for historical precedents because, historical precedents also give us historical responses. Did those policy responses work or not?
Thank you.
Pat, anything?
Yeah, definitely. I was gonna let other people ask some questions, but I have one here. So, you know, does the private sector or new nonprofits have a role in potentially filling some of these gaps left by federal funding?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. So yes, I think, well, a lot of my work has over the past few months has been in talking with foundations and with others about, is there a way that, we can support researchers who are losing their federal funding? Can we support graduate students and postdocs who might be having their careers interrupted by this lapse in federal funding? And so far it's been uneven, but I've been encouraged recently that some states are stepping up. In fact, last week I was on the inaugural meeting of what Massachusetts is calling a DRIVE initiative. It's an initiative to use at a start $400 million in state funds to support research to replace kind of these lost federal funds and canceled federal grants. And you may have heard that last week California floated this proposal to put a bond issue for state funding of research on the ballot next November. So, I mean, those things are happening, but they are going to be drops in the bucket. But I think it's better than nothing. As I said before, $100 billion a year in federal research funding. That's hard to replace by foundations, companies, or states. But at the individual level, we know, I mean, from working at universities, that could make a big difference for specific labs, professors, and students.
Yeah, I think that's great that some states are able to do that, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of states that can't. And
Yeah.
so I do think this, leaving it to the states, I think in one case, you lose that kind of centralized oversight that you
Yeah.
can manage these
Yeah.
investments. And two, like smaller states that don't have a lot of extra income to pass around to their colleges, it kind of widens that gap, which we already have in the first place.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, definitely it's kind of a second best, if not third best solution. And that's why I continue to believe in the important role of the federal government to support research and development all across the country.
Yeah.
Because, one reason that the federal government does that is to, build research capacity across the nation. So it's not just California and Massachusetts that do all the research in this country. And these state policies, if successful, I mean, that's going to go the other way. It's going to make Massachusetts and California more insulated from these federal funding cuts than every other state.
Agreed.
Yeah. I see a question there that are there proactive steps that institutions like ours can take, either to advocate for research or to compensate for the uncertain environment? And I mean, I think the short answer is yes. I mean, we all have to advocate for research, whether it's at your institution or in your state or in the nation. But I'm less certain about what we can do to compensate for the uncertain environment. I don't know how to do that. If anyone has ideas, please tell me, because one reason, I've been talking to people is to get ideas and also the situation on the ground. And I will say that, for example, right now, I am very curious about the state of foreign scholars and students on your campuses. The school year, of course, has begun. And, in a couple of weeks, we will know, the landscape of, how many foreign students and scholars actually showed up for this academic year on your campuses. But if you have early signs of what's happening on your campuses, that's something that I would love to know.
Mhm.
Faru, were you going to say something?
Yeah, with regard to the foundations, something I've heard is that, well, of course, there's a lot more competition, and that they have changed their requirements, where in the past it was a lot more straightforward. Now you actually have to write a detailed proposal, um, similar to an NSF type of proposal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have heard that too. That foundations may be taking the wrong lessons from the federal experience, and making their grant applications more like federal grant applications. And I get why, because as much as I hate the burden of federal research grants, every question or every reporting requirement is there for a reason, right? And so I want to be able to resist that, both for federal grants and also for foundation grants. But I will say that for foundations, what they have been hearing is, well, can you make up federal research funding support, or can you support infrastructure, or can you support like postdocs in new ways? And the foundations, by and large, have said, yeah, we want to try, but we have our own missions. We've supported research for our own missions, whether it is to cure a specific disease or to advance discovery in a certain area. And we have to keep doing our mission, and we cannot be distracted by making up for shortfalls in what the federal government is doing.
I see.
Yeah.
So Kay, as long as no one else has a question, I want to step back a second. And
Sure.
so a lot of these, funding um, changes, I feel have kind of come from a position of erosion of trust in expert knowledge, the scientific establishment. And so putting your social scientist hat on, like how have we arrived at this situation where where the broad populace of America has less trust, more suspicion about experts and the scientific establishment? And how can we get back to finding that trust and the you know the purpose of experts?
Yeah. I think to approach that question backwards, I don't think we are going to get back to that position, because the landscape has changed. Why this public erosion of trust in science? I mean, social scientist colleagues have kind of identified a couple of things. One is, one part of it is, of course, social media and the proliferation of media sources, therefore proliferation of information sources for most people. Third, kind of a deliberate campaign by some political actors to increase distrust in elites, including, of course, knowledge elites, who are, we colloquially call experts. So how do you cannot put that genie back in the bottle. But, what we are trying, and many of my colleagues are trying, is a couple of approaches: increasing public trust in science through increasing public engagement in and participation in scientific research and the use of science. Colloquially, it comes down to this theory that, if scientific elites and the people are not separate, but they're working together, that increases public trust, because the public will have participated in this. I don't know. I think the experiments are ongoing, and I think the jury is out, but it is promising. But another avenue which is being closed off is, there is a field of science of misinformation and disinformation research, because active misinformation, disinformation does create increasing mistrust of science and scientific institutions. And so misinformation and disinformation research helps us to understand this phenomenon and, of course, strategies to combat it. But that is increasingly being, shut down by the U.S. federal government. So those are some thoughts, and it's not a very good feel-good moment because we are lost, and most of us in the sciences and engineering have been like thrown for a loop, especially medical scientists and vaccine scientists, et cetera, we're still reacting to this rapid loss of trust in medical research that dates back to the COVID-19 pandemic, but of course has roots longer than that in vaccine skepticism and distrust of medical research findings.
Thanks. Matthew, did you have a question or did it get answered?
I was actually wanted to, and I'm sorry for camera issues, is that I actually wanted to push back against the premise of your question. Is that I would be curious about some of the sort of broad scale social science research about the trust of particular experts. My first thought is like, do you still trust your local doctor? And is that I feel like what we are experiencing is the collapse of trust of predominantly the corporate hierarchy, or at least CEOs, the profoundly wealthy, in the shared project of collective research and whatnot, whether that's the existence of stuff at NIH, at various other things. I feel like moneyed elites sort of dismissal of expertise is far greater what's impacting us than, say, the broad American public doesn't trust quality assurance engineers at Toyota to make sure that cars work. This is the moneyed folks at the top, and then their willingness to leverage all of that funding to shift the American government in directions that it pleases. But if we do have social scientists on here who can mark out clear differences, I'm happy to be wrong.
I would say that, well, I mean, that I think is one factor, but what's disturbing to me to find is that, well, traditionally in public polling data, right? People ask, surveys ask, do you trust science? Do you trust scientists? Or do you trust the scientists at your local university? Same as, do you trust medical research? Do you trust doctors? How about, do you trust your doctor? And of course, there are gaps. There are differences in how people respond to that. But contained in some of those data is an increasing willingness to be skeptical about what your doctor says about vaccines, or in yesterday's case, Tylenol. And that is worrying to me because it indicates a more general mistrust of scientific information and medical information, and not just increasing skepticism of elites, whether they're corporate elites or scientific elites or what have you.
Well, we're getting close to top of the hour. Is there a last question I'm going to take and ask it?
Well, I have one question.
Go ahead.
A lot of my research has been focused on increasing participation of women in science, engineering, and technology and innovation. And so, with regard to the Chips and Science Act, I know there's that broadening participation. I think it's Title 4, 5, maybe. Um, are there like can the language be turned back around to how it was before? There are a lot, the executive order with all the restrictions. I'm just wondering if there's hope for changing things back.
Um, yes, I have hope. Not necessarily on changing things back to the way they were. I think my focus has been, okay, what is the change that we need to see going forward? Because, going back to, 2022, 2023, I mean, might be appealing, but, by then we'll be in a different year. Um, so what I want to sustain is kind of the objective. The objective, as I said, was broadening participation in the science and engineering enterprise. And that includes, you know, our research shows that there are certain groups in society that are disproportionately excluded from the science and engineering enterprise. And among them, of course, is women. And so actions. I hope to get back to a place where we can target, disadvantaged communities in the sciences with specific actions to increase their participation. Are we going to call it diversity, equity, and inclusion? Maybe, maybe not. Are we going to resurrect the NSF Advanced program? Maybe, maybe not. But I hope we can get to a point where some of those strategies and policies will be back in play. And I will say that, one part of the Chips and Science Act that I am proud of is the work to end harassment in the sciences and engineering, especially sexual and gender-based harassment, because we know from the data that that disproportionately affects the ability of women to participate in science and engineering. So the implementation actions that we were able to do in the last years of the Biden administration are important. And I don't want them to be interrupted. But if they are, I want to be in a position to resume those because, the data continue to show that we need to keep taking action to create a more safe and welcoming research environment for everyone, but with disproportionate impact on certain people.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of our time. Kei, thanks so much for joining us and providing your insights. This has been super awesome, and I think we've had some great questions and some good conversation. And hope you got a little bit out of this as well, as much as well. So for the rest of the group, next month we have first in our Getting Started With series for emerging centers. Getting started with grant writing. So we're going to have a community discussion about how to kind of prepare yourself and be ready for that grant solicitation that comes out. And then a little bit about, some tips and tricks from some of us that have gotten awards in the past. So that's next month, October 15th. Hope to see some of you there. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great week.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.